here's the funny thing about Vodafone for me. Like, what's one of the big sort of strategic move, or the big kind of thing that's going to have an impact on the balance sheet, I guess, that they've done in the last few years, is offloading these towers into this separate vehicle, Vantage Towers, which is all about, we talked about this before, all about sort of freeing up capital for other investment activities and
it's the sort of thing you
becoming
do.
more asset light.
I mean, I've always thought, and maybe this is a massive oversimplification of it, but when you start selling the family silver, it's because you've got liquidity problems. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're recording this a mere 6 days after the last one because Ian and I have got some other stuff to do tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Fun stuff.
Well, let's see. But yeah, basically it's that time of year, punters. So use your imagination. I really enjoyed that chat with Neil. Has good feedback from it.
Yeah, that was good.
And that was all groovy. And you're welcome on any time, Neil, even if your next job's shite.
Even if it's for a server company.
Even if you're working at McDonald's next, making sure that the Wi-Fi in one restaurant is working. So that's all groovy. And it's been a quiet week for news. I'm sort of apologising for us not having particularly compelling topics to talk about, but we'll manage one or two things. And actually, sometimes I find as a journalist, I mean, this is something you already do very well, Ian, and something I'm trying to do more. When there isn't a bit of news that really grabs your imagination, you have to take a step back and be a bit more creative and think, well, can I write an analysis piece or an opinion piece or, something that just threads a few themes together and adds a bit of value. I'll let the audience be the judge of whether, whenever either of us try that, we're successful. But I certainly think you are. And at least one of the things we're going to talk about this week is sort of me going off on one. So we'll probably have a bit more opinion-y stuff and we'll see where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Not much else to say. It's been sort of pissing it down all week. It's pretty gloomy, isn't it?
It's miserable. When's it going to end? It's like the
Saturday. Apparently, it's meant to be nice on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, last weekend was actually quite nice. Can't complain about that. But every other day seems to have rained for about 3 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's got so that I've got to have my light on in the middle of the day.
Yeah. We had that baking hot summer, and now it's overcompensating for it.
Well, it's not mega cold. It's just incredibly gloomy.
And when it gets cold, it's going to be nice, but your energy bill will skyrocket.
Oh, we've actually had the energy on a little bit. I mean, I do feel the cold now that the heating on.
Yeah.
I feel the cold now that
I just have it on.
Cold. I don't know what it is.
I mean, I didn't do it till November, and I'm just doing 1 hour in the morning just so that it doesn't feel too nasty when you're getting out of bed.
Yeah.
And then I'm all about the layers during the day.
Yeah, well, I try and do that, but then in the evenings I tend to put it on a little bit.
Can you see your breath when you're working?
Not quite, but there will come a time.
I mean, do you sit there though? Because I'm sitting there and I can feel my hands and my nose sometimes are a little bit.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah. And well, like I said, layers. I'm on at least 3 layers. I've even got like thermal long johns these days.
My God.
Yeah,
because my working from home wear is basically pajama bottoms. I'm giving a lovely image for our audience here.
With the suit jackets.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. When I'm doing like a commercial video, I've actually got gym jams on below the screen.
I think there was one of the mayors of one of the northern European cities, like Brussels or something like that, was doing a Zoom
and then he
call
stood
during
up
the pandemic with his suit and tie and stood up, and he just not thinking the camera was on him, and he just had his underwear on.
Not as bad as that CNN journalist who was knocking one out.
That's a lot worse, clearly.
And he's still got a job, which is incredible. It's pretty hard to get fired from CNN.
Weird, yeah.
I'm certainly not going to test that policy here. What was I going to say? So yeah, that's that really. Nothing much else to report.
Tis the season of Christmas outings, though, nearly.
Yes, exactly. And as I sort of alluded to, that's sort of what we're doing tomorrow.
Yeah,
we'll do some work, but sometimes you got to hang out with companies you write about, and
well, it's kind of partly work related, isn't it? Because
yeah, exactly.
I remember last year the company in question did a bit of an update on how they're getting on in the UK.
No, my conscience is clear.
It's not private. Can't we say who it is? Or
no, we say it's Ericsson. Yeah, going out for lunch with Ericsson, and they tend to do a long lunch. which is fair play.
Yeah.
It'll be sushi tomorrow. So I think they'd done that before, didn't they? We went to Sexy Fish once with them.
It's always fish, isn't it? Because they're Scandinavians.
Yeah,
That's all Scandinavians eat.
Basically, it's just pickled herring, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for them. So yeah, but that tends to be a longer lunch, a sort of continental lunch.
Yes.
So we're assuming that by the time that's done, we're not going to be much good for anything.
No.
So there we go. All right. Anyway, we must not witter. What we're going to chat about this week, I think the one story, certainly in terms of traffic on Telecoms.com, that seemed to catch the eye was Vodafone's quarterlies, where it wasn't just. I mean, I've got to admit, I'm sort of reluctant to write up Telecoms quarterlies because I find them a bit dry. Because in many ways, in terms of their sort of volatility as a company, they're like utilities. They're just sort of steady. It's like single figure growth or decline. It's like, okay, they did a little bit better than last year.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Now I can hear my voice through Pierre's computer.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes
makes me sound
they
like an
have,
idiot. Thanks a lot. I'm really self-conscious now.
I think some of the big telcos in Europe have had some steep, earnings drops based on sort of costs, inflation, while sort of revenues have remained fairly flat.
Yeah. There's stuff. If you can be bothered,
sometimes
there
you just
are
have to look
there
for
are tea leaves to read.
You have to look for the other stuff.
Totally, and I'm going to lean heavily on you for that one. Not least because Mary wrote it for us, and while I obviously edited her stuff, it's not the same as writing it. It's not sort of stuck in my head that much.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that. Then I think I wrote a thing. I sort of wrote it yesterday evening. Ofcom came up with this press release going, "Who controls the news we see online?" Which is an ominous begging of the question straight away, if you ask me, because presumably if they were happy with who controlled it, they wouldn't be sending out press releases like that.
Yeah.
And and the spoiler is they're not happy that it's largely controlled by Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And they think something should be done.
Is it controlled by Google? And
well,
Facebook
that's what they
Twitter?
reckon. Well, that's a good. You push back.
Sure
Feel free to push back on that. Believe me, I'm not supportive of Ofcom on this. Yeah, I think anyone who listens to the pod regularly will know where I am on control of speech and censorship
for other reasons is fine. But I'm not really sure that I agree with that.
Well, quite. So we're getting to that. And then lastly, I thought it might be fun. I was going to bring it up last week, but as the final segment of Is It Bollocks that I hastily improvised showed, we ran out of time and I had to sort of squeeze what could have been topics for an entire podcast or series of podcasts into about 10 minutes just to pick Neil's brains. And I was going to ask him about crypto. I don't know if he would have known much, but he's just such a technically savvy guy that I thought he might have something to say on that.
Yeah.
Or even he just would have said something vaguely Alan Hansen-ish, like, I wouldn't go there if I were you, or something like that. But I didn't, so... But this FTX thing's been rumbling for like a week or two now, and I thought it might be fun to get into that with the caveat that none of us really know what the fuck we're talking about in that space. But that's never stopped me before. Mm-hmm. In fact, you could say I've made a career on talking about stuff.
I mean, when
really
it comes to crypto, I'm really in the dark.
Yeah. Well, let's see how we go.
It's not surprising.
I think Pierre's a bit younger. He keeps an eye on this sort of thing. He might be able to enlighten us. Let's see. I don't want to promise too much on your behalf, Pierre.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so that's that really. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also listen to it on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Okay, as I just promised, Vodafone. You wrote it up, Ian. I only edited it and published it, so I'm going to lean on you. What did Vodafone have to say about it? Lean on me. There we are. Steady.
I mean, some of it was like what you've just been saying, like the headline. More so than other operators, they tend to come out and you look at the trading updates, which don't even report profitability, by the way. So they only do that once every 6 months.
Oh, right. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, this was one of the 6 months.
Okay.
It's a half year and full year, and they report to an end of March financial year. So then you get an insight into what's going on at the cost level and the profit level. But like the other 2 quarters, it's just sales. And you're sometimes looking through Vodafone's reports and it's like, it's really weird, some of the calls I find on, because if you've been on a BT earnings call, so the analysts are asking questions like, you're trying to increase prices for consumers, but at the same time you're lowering your wholesale costs to drive the competition out of business. How's Ofcom going to receive something like that? Which I think is a brilliant question.
Yep.
Whereas on Vodafone's earnings call, all the questions are like sort of things that allow you to tweak your little cell in your spreadsheet that shows what's going to happen long term with ARPU for this particular customer segment.
I remember Heath hopefully won't mind me mentioning it. Former colleague of mine and has been a reliable judge on the Glotels, which are coming up in a couple of weeks, our awards thing. Phil Kendall from Strategy Analytics.
Right.
When I used to work with him, part of his job was keeping this enormous spreadsheet. Right. That just covered all the quarterly stuff and all the derivative data points that you get from it. And he used to say that was a big part of his job, was just keeping totally on top of it. I know, and I can
understand why they're doing. They have different priorities, but maybe the things that the equity analysts are covering are important, but I'm not getting it. But sometimes the calls, you're on them and you're sort of hanging for Nick Reed, the CEO, to say something really interesting, and it's 5 minutes maybe. There'll be one question about something strategic, But so the headline figures were basically, I think revenue. I've got it here. Revenues were up 2% year over year for the first half.
That's adjusted for adjustments.
I think that's organic. I think that which is
and currency and all that stuff they have to adjust for.
And then net income was down about 2.7%, which is, if you look at some of the other telcos that have. Because the issue at the moment obviously is inflation and energy costs, which I'll come on to in a bit. But some of the operators have had quite a big impact from that, and some of the equipment vendors that we cover as well have seen more sort of sizable drops in the bottom line because of those factors. So, it kind of doesn't look that bad, but at the same time, here's the funny thing about Vodafone for me. Like, what's one of the big sort of strategic move, or the big kind of thing that's going to have an impact on the balance sheet, I guess, that they've done in the last few years, is offloading these towers into this separate vehicle, Vantage Towers, which is all about, we talked about this before, all about sort of freeing up capital for other investment activities and
it's the sort of thing you
becoming
do.
More asset light.
I've always thought, and maybe this is a massive oversimplification of it, but when you start selling the family silver, it's because you've got liquidity problems. Yeah. If you had plenty of cash in the bank, you'd hold on to the goddamn silver, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, they obviously don't pitch it that way, but there's no way, and this is the thing, you look at their net debt figure, which I did, which at the end of, what are we talking about? We're talking about end of September, I guess, it was 45.5 billion, which is, it's about 12.3 billion, this is euros, 45.5 billion euros. It's about 12.3 billion euros more than Vodafone's market cap this week. And it's gone up by...
So their debt is higher than their market cap?
Their debt's a lot higher than their market cap.
Sorry, say those numbers again. They sort of didn't sink in.
Their net debt is 45.5 billion euros.
And their market cap's about...
that's their market cap's in the early 30s.
So it's like up to 50% more.
Yeah, so...
God damn.
So, which isn't good, obviously.
It's not
like
ideal.
you sell Vodafone, you could just cover the debt sort of thing. And the other thing is that the debt's gone up. I didn't delve into the reasons why the debt's gone up, but it's gone up by quite a bit since the end of March, like 3 or 4 billion, I think, or something. 3.9 billion, I think it was, euros. Now, the proceeds they're expecting from this, this deal they did on Vantage Towers that was announced in the last few days, where they've sold a stake to KKR, is it?
And sort of private
maybe it's not
types.
KKR, but it's private equity.
I think KKR was involved.
They've sold a stake, so I think they own about 81% of Vantage Towers, and the other part of it has already sort of been listed or whatever. They've sold half of what they own basically to private equity with some Saudi financing, and I think the objective is to try and end up, through other sort of moves that they're going to make, is to try and end up with a half of the whole thing eventually. So they have a 50% share in Vantage Towers. They pitch that as co-control, but to me, co-control means you're not in control. So that is not what Nick Reed said a few years ago. He said they would always retain a majority stake in the asset.
Yeah, that was Mary's angle when she read it for us. She said it's all about control.
Yeah, and to me, co-control is not control. How can co-control be control?
Seems
you
like
can't
slightly...
have companies with two CEOs never really work out. Yeah, there's always potential there.
There's got to be a tiebreaker.
Strategy.
There's two CEOs at Tesla.
Is there?
Yeah, and who do we think's in charge of Tesla?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly, mate.
So this co-control thing for a start is one thing I have an issue with. The other thing is what they're expecting, the deal that they've done, what they're expecting in proceeds from that they can actually pocket, and what they want to do is use this to pay off net debt. Is at least it's a range, but the minimum figure they're expecting is 3.2 billion. So basically, that figure that they've raised in proceeds is not enough to cover the increase in net debt that they've seen alone since the end of March.
Just to cover the increase.
That doesn't even cover the increase, you know.
But they've got to keep raising money. You do wonder, you know, something's got to give.
And there was a lot of talk on the call about, you know, if they do end up with, if things go better than that, and they end up with this 50% stake, and there's more money they can get from the deal, it goes up to about 5.8 billion, which would obviously
there was a sort of sliding
that
scale.
would obviously chew into net debt a bit more. But you're still left with an enormous amount of net debt that needs to be dealt with at some point.
It's sort of like countries. That's something that's always done my head in. You look at, like right now, I think we're in the middle of our Cockney rhyming slang Chancellor Jeremy Hunt doing a you know what I meant, doing some kind of autumn statement of the state of everything. And he's basically going, yeah, we're fucked. Everyone's going to have to get less public services and pay more tax and eat less and have less fun.
Yeah.
And then you look at the debt. I mean, you know, the funny thing, sorry, this is a massive sort of
no, it's not,
political
it's relevant
tangent.
to it.
But yeah, you look at what Truss tried that made her be the shortest serving Prime Minister ever, where her angle was like, fuck it, let's get more debt, but invest to grow.
Yeah,
and then it'll, you know, it's that multiplier effect, isn't it? It'll
totally
pay itself off.
And there's no sort of consensus on this. You know, it's very much a division of.
And you hear people talk about modern monetary theory, which is basically saying borrow as much as you want.
And I know that everybody obviously makes Truss and Kwarteng out to be a couple of muppets now, but there are a lot of economists who actually bought into that and supported it. They wrote it. They were written up in the Spectator, I remember, and it sounded very compelling. If you read the article that one of them wrote, they made out that the reason it all went disastrously wrong is it just wasn't sold very well. They didn't do the whole.
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of it. But the point is, as you say, for some people that was feasible. Now we seem to be overcorrecting, and Hunt's going. Everyone's got to be skint for years. Yeah, and the danger is then that people don't spend any money and we end up in some kind of spiral of stagflation or whatever.
But this is exactly what I think with this Vodafone. It's sort of like bailing out a flooded home with a small bucket, and then the next day the water levels have risen again. You know, it's this figure of 45 billion is. You know, and this whole Vantage Towers.
How do they get in so much debt?
You know, what are the attractions of spinning off your? You know, if that deal was about raising cash to pay off debt and free up resources, where's it got them? It's paid off some of the increase this year, and now they don't have control over their towers because co-control isn't control. And you know they're in the situation that you've talked about in the past, where they're tenants, they're not landowners,
they're not owners, yeah.
And you know, and there's a conflict of interest, isn't there? And this is the thing. I don't think any of this is very well regulated. This tower stuff. The idea of it's very controversial in the fixed line broadband market that Openreach is a part of BT because BT sells retail broadband services that it buys. You know, it basically buys the capacity from Openreach in the same way that other companies do. And there's always this talk about should it be spun off and be a completely separate vehicle, and it's a lot more transparent and it's not owned by, you know, the same company that's a retailer. Yet in the towers market, you have a similar situation, don't you? Vodafone is selling, you know, it's selling services at the end of the day, but it's renting capacity on this infrastructure that's used by its competitors. You know, in Germany, for instance, it's the company that's you know supplying tower infrastructure to 1&1.
Oh, and there was some aggro around that.
Well, they Vantage Towers was basically outed as the organisation responsible for delays. Now, I'm not saying that was deliberate. I mean, they're not going to. It's not going to be a deliberate move to try and screw up 1&1 at a time when they're trying to get funding for Vantage Towers and they're trying to present themselves as a good company to work with and a responsible towers company. I'm not saying that, but there's certainly a conflict of interest. I mean, does Vodafone pay less for renting space on those towers than 1&1 does? You know, I mean, I've never heard anybody talk about that because in the, as I say, the example of Openreach is that's very heavily regulated. They have to charge the same price to BT's retail arm that they charge to people like TalkTalk or whoever it might be, or Sky Broadband.
Indeed.
Now, I don't know how it works in towers, but Vodafone's renting space on the same towers that are used by people like 1&1. So what are the charges exactly the same? You know, I mean, I
don't even know much about German telecoms regulation.
And there's a conflict of interest because the investors in Vantage Towers, it's in their interest to see those rental fees go up. I mean, obviously they don't want to scare people away, and they don't want to cripple the market, but they want to make more money from rent.
But if someone like Vantage or Cellnex or American Towers or whatever happens to get themselves in a position where they have a very strong position in a given geographical market, let's say the UK, where they own greater than 50% of all the towers,
which has become a concern because that's been flagged by Ofcom.
Yeah, and then it does, like anything else, becomes a matter of monopoly because they can raise prices, and if people go, no, it's too expensive, they go, well then fuck you, you can't use our towers. And you got no choice because they own so much of the market.
And that market's already becoming concerned. So here was the other interesting thing that I think came up on the call was Nick Reed's comments about consolidation in that market, that he sees an opportunity for them to play a role in consolidation, which suggests that they might look to acquire other tower companies or certainly do what Cellnex has done and go off on some kind of buying spree, you know. And he was talking about the market ending up with 3 or 4 players in the long run across the region. And this is the thing, you know, it's 3 or 4 players. Why is that okay in towers, but having 3 big players in RAN equipment isn't okay, you know, and we want dozens of different options. You know, there's all these sort of inconsistencies I find, and you know, and there's a clear, as I said, there's the clear conflict of interest that Vodafone is selling mobile services but also positioning itself as a tower company.
Well, this is going to have some parallels with our final segment on crypto, because I think what happens is you get mature markets like telecoms and markets that were former state monopolies, and obviously regulators, presumably Ofcom, if it didn't exist before, was created at a time that BT was privatised. You know, precisely because they know that if you're going to privatise a monopoly, it's got to be regulated, otherwise it would just go mental.
Yeah.
But then you get certain markets creep up on regulators and authorities, where, you know, and you could argue this has happened with the whole internet sector, where they're trying to play catch up right now. This actually might slightly overlap with the second segment as well, where you know, people like Google and Facebook are just making silly amounts of money and have silly amounts of control over the public domain. You know, the area that interests me the most, which is speech, and regulators are only now going, oh, hold on a minute, how'd that happen? Well, it's been happening for over a decade.
Yeah.
So my point is that maybe towers is another example of one where they've just sort of let it run riot. And on the whole, as a sort of, you know, laissez-faire kind of guy that I am, I'm in favour of it. But I'm not in favour of monopolies. And as I've said many times on this pod before, Adam Smith, who's, you know, the father of sort of modern economics in many ways, was the first to warn about cartels.
Yeah.
Was the first to warn about how if you allow cartels and monopolies, then everyone gets ripped off except the people in the cartel or monopoly. So I think you might have a point there that with the towers, it's suddenly the consolidation's been so rapid, and Cellnex went on a buying spree
it's one
for
of those things
years, isn't it?
Yes, I mean the thing that I'd say about Cellnex that I like about Cellnex is, and that I like about Crown Castle and American Tower and the other ones, is that they're independent tower companies. Yeah, they call themselves neutral host, don't they?
Right.
Is the way it's pitched, but they're independent tower companies. Cellnex doesn't sell retail mobile services. You know, it doesn't have a service provider business. It just rents space on its towers, on its masts, to the likes of Vodafone or Three or whoever it might be. Whereas Vodafone is, you know, it's using those towers to support the equipment that it uses to sell mobile services, basically, and also trying to get other companies to do the same thing. So
you can get some stuff like, no, I mean this doesn't really contradict your point at all, but I'll go with it as it sprung to mind. You can get sort of co-opetition type of stuff. For example, Rakuten. With its Open RAN, but the reason that's not directly equivalent is Rakuten's not offering Open RAN technology to other Japanese.
Yeah, it isn't exactly. Yeah, so I find the whole thing, the emergence of these tower cos that also have retail service provider units, a bit odd, really. It just, and I don't know whether, this is something to look into now that I've mentioned it on the pod, because I've not really asked regulators about this.
I think I know what your Monday editorial is.
I might sort of have to reach out and sort of talk to Ofcom about it and try and get in touch with them. Did they look at this? Because they're obviously very, very rigorous in terms of Openreach and what it does, but do they look at tower companies that also have service provider arms and in terms of what they charge for renting space on those towers? You have that tenancy ratio, don't you? That's 1.5, I think, at Vodafone, which essentially means 1.5 companies per tower is on average using it. So it's mainly themselves, I guess, and they're trying to get the amount up that comes from operating companies outside the Vodafone group. But and if I was a 1&1 or whoever it might be, a company without my own towers, I think I'd be drawn to using a Cellnex before. You obviously want the best deal possible and the best price possible, but instinctively, surely you'd want to go for one of the neutral host ones rather than a company that you're competing against in the market, because you'd think, well, potentially what's going on here? Am I getting the same price that they're charging their own operating company? It's going to go on in the back of your mind, isn't it? Maybe it isn't if it's very well regulated, but I don't know if it is. I'm not sure that any of this stuff's looked at that rigorously by regulators. The other thing that came out of the other thing on Vodafone's results is, they don't have, like other telcos, they don't have a growth story. This is why their service revenues go up 2% at most every quarter, or sometimes they go down a little bit, but it's pretty flat. They don't have that. So we're now looking at, this is a problem for these companies, they're now looking at huge energy costs. If they have European businesses, they're looking at a workforce that's asking for more money because.
Did you see? I think the latest inflation numbers were 11.5%.
So 11.5%, yeah. So BT staff have gone on strike because they're heavily unionised and they've been asking for inflation match pay increases, and BT's basically said no, you can have between 5 and 8%. Have you
noticed the difference, like in groceries? I'm sure I'm spending a shitload more on groceries.
Yeah, I usually base mine on price of beer. Price of beer index, isn't it? That's the main one.
No, well, mine is like my price of going to Sainsbury's or Costco. I think.
Yeah, I don't do the shopping. Yeah,
you see, I'm a more enlightened man.
None of my money goes on groceries. I basically pay for. I pay for all the other things.
That's your missus half a thing. Yeah. But you do the rent and the bills, but she does the groceries.
She does the groceries. Yeah. No, but she does come back.
If she was here, she'd go.
She would. Yeah.
She'd go. Oh my god.
No, because she comes back in with the bags and goes, "That's ridiculous. What I've just had to spend on this."
There we go.
And more often than not, recently she's been going out to places like Lidl where you can still get decent deals. I think, but they don't have. I know.
I tried Lidl once, twice. I didn't like it, but I might have to give it another look.
Yeah. I'm happy that you can still go to Tesco's and get 3 big bottles of Star for £5 with a Tesco Club card.
Or get this 4-pack of Hazy Jane for £5.50.
I'm waiting for it to go up to £6, but
well, actually, £5.50 is a 10% price promotion. I think you'll find.
So they've got.
But £1.50 for a tin is still affordable, isn't it? Even though they're stubbies.
It is. So they've got higher energy costs. They've got higher staff costs potentially, and they've got higher leases. Probably higher lease costs.
You'll hire everything.
Higher everything, and therefore and that's why the margins are being squeezed, and the outlook's not very pleasant for the next sort of 12, 24 months or whatever. So what's the response? Like a lot of other companies that we've already talked about in the tech sector. And other telcos, they're on another sort of cost-cutting mission.
Yeah,
they've always got cost-cutting missions. Vodafone.
So that was Mary's headline. It was Vodafone to cut $1 billion in costs.
$1 billion, yeah.
And raise prices.
3.5 years.
Over 3.5 years, right?
Which they didn't mention in the release, but they said that was the target sort of timeline for it on the call. And there was no mention of what that would mean in terms of headcount reductions or anything, because you can obviously realise savings in other areas, but a quarter of operating costs is on the workforce. Yeah, it's much higher than what they spend on energy. I think energy is about 5%. Most of it's in salaries.
Well, generally that's the case of all companies, isn't it?
Yeah. So and then you look at what the things they have said in their earnings statements, and it's things like streamlining and further simplifying the group, using more digitalisation, automation, and they've talked about the retail footprint. So you can see where all this is going. It's about
streamlining. Streamlining is always a euphemism for tightening your belt.
Yeah. I mean, they don't. They make a big deal about and I wrote this in my story, they make a big deal about digitalisation and automation, like a lot of other telcos, Vodafone, and yet they don't seem to me to be very automated. You know, if you look at because I track job cuts in the sector, and if you look at their staff numbers,
they haven't been going down that much.
Well, they have, but you've got to ask why they've been going down. So I think they peaked you go back to 2016, 2015, and they had about 111, 112,000 employees. And that all went down to 95,000 in 2019.
Right.
But a lot of that was to do with the divestment of Vodafone, what's now Vodafone Idea in India. And they also spun off some other assets as well, like the Dutch business.
How much? Because I'm still struck by the sheer debt burden, and I know it's not unique to Vodafone. I know, for example, Telefónica's always had a shitload of debt.
Yeah.
But Jesus Christ, that's a lot. When you consider that they, in the not too distant past, flogged their stake in Verizon.
Yeah.
Which brought in a big chunk of cash.
They then went off on a spending spree. So capital intensity in 2015, it was called Project Spring, if you remember.
Right.
When they basically used all the money they got. Project Splurge. I think, you look at it's.
Was it all the way back in 2015 when they got?
That's when they started using the money in a big sort of way to try and deal with some of their network issues, and because they were perceived to be a bit crap, I think, at the time in terms of quality, and I think they've probably overcome that to some extent in a lot of countries. You know, we've had people talking about that, but. That sort of capital expenditure as a percentage of revenues ratio normally tracks at somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on what you're doing. Theirs went right up to sort of 22% in 2015.
Right.
You know, and a lot of that I think was taking advantage of that Verizon money. But you're right. You know, all these things they've sold. The latest one being the towers, and they're still carrying 45 billion in net debt and are at somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times. It's the ratio is normally net debt to EBITDA, isn't it? The one that normally gets used. But right. I quite like to look at it just as a percentage of what their actual market cap is, because if your debt's worth more than you're worth, you know, than your value essentially, I don't think it doesn't sound very good at all, does it?
No, I try I know one shouldn't. But sometimes just to help me get my head around some of these abstract numbers, I try and personalise it.
Yeah.
And think of my net debt in terms of like my mortgage debt.
Sure.
Versus my salary, or you know, obviously trying to put a market cap on me as an individual is impossible because I'm not a publicly traded company. But obviously individuals, you know, most people's mortgages are many multiples of their annual salary. So. You know, if you look at that in terms of debt, or as Americans call it, leverage, you know, you can do it, but it's, you know, we could probably all as individuals relate to times where we felt that our debt is unsustainable and we're just down every month.
Yeah.
And we're not sure how to get out of it because the debts are long-term debts that aren't going to get paid off for 5+ years.
It's like being overdrawn at the end of every month.
Yeah, exactly. And you're just down every month and you're just like, how the fuck do I sort this out?
Yeah.
You normally find a way, but it's tough. And, you know, you get the impression that companies like Vodafone, like that, countries certainly are. I mean, this is, you know, back to the political stuff. I mean, around, you know, the amount of debt, if you look at charts for our borrowing, and how exponential they went in 2020 with the furloughs and all that. And I think that's really what did for Liz Truss. If she tried that shit in normal times, people might just gone, all right, let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
But we'd already ramped it so much with the furloughs and all that for her to say, firstly, we're going to do loads of tax cuts. Secondly, we're going to underwrite everyone's energy bills to an unlimited extent.
Yeah.
With no cap. And it looks like, I think the price of sort of oil and gas has stabilised a little bit compared to a few months ago, but it's still,
some of the contracts are still locked in, I think.
Well, and it could still go anywhere.
But it's the same as Vodafone CEO going, we're going to start providing free services to attract customers,
right?
And we're going to bundle all this extra stuff in, and maybe we're going to go and buy 1 or 2 businesses, while they're carrying 45 billion in net debt, and there's pressure on them to sort of reduce that number, because that's what clearly they wouldn't be doing it if the market thought that it was okay to have your net debt at 2.5 to 3 times EBITDA.
Yeah.
In a low growth industry these days, let's be honest, it's not like they're looking forwards to 20% sales growth next year, and and hence these regular cost-cutting initiatives. But just going back to those numbers, so it went down from about 111,000 to 95,000 in 2019. I mean, it's gone up since then by another 1,700. It's crept back up.
Right.
And you sort of think, well, if all those cuts, they talk about automation and digitalisation, but if the majority of those cuts were to, and I've even asked them about this in the past because they've got a bit irritated by a couple of things I've written when I've sort of suggested that they want to turn everybody into, get rid of customer service reps.
Oh, that's it. You've got for people who aren't familiar, you've got a sort of fairly persistent editorial theme of job cuts in the telecom sector.
I have, and I think the trend across a lot of these big telcos is for the numbers to have been going down for years now, and they keep going down. It was very, very different from what we see in the tech sector, where it's gone up for years and it's now bad this year. And you always speculate about the reasons, and there are some companies that can really clearly link it to automation, like Telenor, for instance. Now, again, they've divested a lot of stuff. They got out of India as well. That's one of the reasons their numbers have gone down a lot. But they really make a strong connection to some of the stuff they've done in terms of, not needing as many people for, network operation centres and this kind of stuff and things like that. And I wonder with Vodafone, they talk a lot about things like Toby, that chatbot they've got that answers queries. And they talk a lot about having, I hate the expression, but zero touch, network.
That's right. Like it is ever zero touch.
And yet, if that's the case, then why do they need that many people still? Why has the number gone up by 1,700?
Well, and one of the things could be something that we've spoken about many times on the pod, because it's been something that Vodafone have been pushing hard, is this, and it's not just them, it's an industry cliche, this evolving from a telco to a techco.
Yeah.
And having these parallel, streams where they've got the people who do the traditional network side, but then they got the more general techie ones, and they want to have more in-house. And we can't criticise them too much because we're first to criticise operators when they outsource all their IT to big public cloud providers. But on the flip side, doing it all in-house is expensive.
Yeah, well, I mean, they claim to be outsourcing stuff that they don't. A lot of the telcos claim to be outsourcing stuff like that to public cloud to get savings. But the standard response when you say, why isn't headcount going down if you can automate and digitalise stuff and you can rely on zero-touch networks and you can rely on chatbots, why isn't your headcount going down? And let's remember, they don't necessarily want to be perceived as companies that are cutting into employee numbers because of AI, because it might be what investors want to hear, but it's not good for a sort of policy perspective, is it?
No.
Jobs creation perspective, the other stakeholders basically. So they're kind of very nervous when that issue gets brought up, I think. But the standard response is that if you emancipate your employees from a sort of lifetime of drudgery through investment in these chatbots or whatever it might be, it frees them to go off and do more gainful things with their day.
Yes.
Well, if that's the case, why are their revenues only up 2% at a time of rampant inflation?
Yeah. Well,
something's not worked.
I mean, I feel like a bit of a scratch record. It's hard to know. When we were talking to Neil last week, one of the things I'm really keen to do when I've got someone as senior as him is to sort of get a sense of what it's like at the top table. And it's hard to know if you're Philip Jansen or Nick Reed or whoever. I thought Neil said some interesting things about how, if you're a CEO, one of the things you do is M&A, innit? It's just what you fucking do.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I think most M&A that I've covered in my business journalism career has normally been shite. I think maybe that the context in which they come up was one of the shitest ever, which was AT&T with Time Warner.
Well, I think big M&A often doesn't work.
Is, yeah,
small takeovers.
Obviously, buying Light Reading was an inspired move by Informer.
Exactly.
But yeah, so that's sort of what you do, and I'm picturing, if you're a CEO and every now and then people are going, so what have you done other than just keep the ship on a steady course? What's different between you and us just putting fucking Toby the bot in charge of the company? And then they have to go, well, I've got a new strategy, or we've done some big M&A, or I've done this really conspicuous thing. But maybe maybe that's just not within the purview of a telco CEO. Maybe the best they can hope for is plotting a steady course and getting low single digits growth a year, and that's it. And that's all you're going to get.
I mean, I know with Vodafone, and they've got this plan obviously to hire, 7,000 software engineers or whatever, recruit 7,000 software engineers over the next few years to help them be less.
Yeah, which seems to not be progressing that quickly.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's difficult. I mean, they were talking about that at that event we went to, where these people aren't easy to find. You have to pay them quite a lot of money. You have to pay them even more now.
And why, with all due respect, would they go Vodafone and not someone
totally.
else?
But and that's why I suppose they're trying to retrain to some extent people they've got internally. And if you've got an initiative like that going on, it's going to be very hard to get your headcount down. But I just sort of feel, this argument that and Neil said this as well, actually. I don't think I'm putting unfair words into his mouth here, that he has this vision of BT being very highly automated in future, being able to sort of shut down some of these old legacy platforms that needed a lot of people to run them, and everything kind of works. He said this on the pod, everything sort of works itself out.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, what do the people do who used to do that? And the idea is, well, you can then have people involved in like the BT digital side of stuff, where it's more about creating new services and doing stuff that makes money for you.
That's the thing, isn't it? We've been talking about digital transformation.
Exactly. This is the thing. It's like, when's it going to happen? Because the clock's ticking. Look, you look at the growth of big tech. Big tech wasn't big tech even 6-7 years ago. I don't even know when that expression first started to get used, but they weren't very big companies a decade ago in terms of revenues.
Well, we have big. I mean, some commentators like to use the term big, but it's often in quite a conspiratorial way.
Yeah,
if you're in the more sort of
like Snap and Twitter, which are
but also if you're in the back alleys of the internet, people will talk about big pharma and big this and big that.
Yeah.
But the inference always is that there's some kind of cabal of Illuminati types.
But what I'm saying is, a big pharma has been there for a long, long time, and
never more so.
And big
than
banks have been there for a long, long time. But tech's quite a new thing.
Fair
in the
enough.
terms we talk about tech. We didn't have the internet as a thing we were using until the late
and yet they're like
90s or whatever.
They're like 3 of the top 5 in terms of global market cap, like Apple.
Yeah,
Microsoft.
I mean, when was Google founded even, and then it didn't really make that much money for a long time. You look back at Facebook's revenues. When it was the year that they founded the Telecom Infra project, I remember they were about 17 billion. So they're now 120 billion or whatever. So this is a problem with this digital transformation, as they call it. We're freeing up staff to go and do other things. Well, you better get cracking, because it's just going to be too late.
Well, talking about digital transformation, I mean, and we spoke about this on the pod. You remember when we went to Digital Transformation World in Copenhagen? It seems like ages ago now, doesn't it?
It does seem a long time ago, and it wasn't that long ago,
I was just having a brief email exchange with Anais from CC Group and just going, because that's the last time I saw her. I was like, fucking hell, that feels like so long ago.
Yeah, no, it was.
And what was I going to say? Yeah, and the underlying theme of Digital Transformation World was get in bed with hyperscalers, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So there we are.
I mean that was the most notable thing for me, is that event, because it hasn't been on for 3 years.
Yeah.
I remember going there would have been 2019, wouldn't it, when it was in Nice. Don't remember Google or AWS or Microsoft being talked about much or having any real presence there. And we did an interview with Microsoft's guy, Rick, and it was that was the biggest change for me, really. Those companies have now got big telco ambitions themselves, as they have in other sectors, and you just sort of feel the opportunity's not going to be there, basically, unless telcos move fast, and they don't move fast. And all this talk
I just wonder if they can. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this.
No, I'm not saying I can make it work.
As I rely on being the editor of Telecoms.com to pay my bills.
Yeah.
But there's a part of me that just feels like telcos. It's almost like they should just throw in the towel and go, look, we're utilities. Let's do that well. Let's just sort of refocus on our core competence and stop fucking about with other little bits and bobs.
Yeah.
I mean, can you think of a single digital product produced by a telco you've ever used?
I don't know what digital means, really.
Well, like an app or or a subscription.
Well, I use EE's app to figure out how much data I've used sometimes and be able to transfer stuff to my son.
That's what I do. I use EE's app for gifting data. Yeah. But what I mean, as a novel commercial thing, as something that enables them to grow and diversify. I'm an EE customer. I don't use anything except their app, and that's just because I found out. I was advised by an excellent advisor of theirs that I'd save money by just having a big fat contract for myself and a thin contract for the rest of my family, and me just manually doshing out data. And it's worked well. I've been doing it for years.
I think it's too late for them really now. I think
it feels like that to me.
I mean, this is getting back to the Vantage Towers thing. If you extrapolate this and try and look sort of 5-10 years into the future, where's telecom going to be? I don't think it's unrealistic to see that all the infrastructure is. Maybe there's been some consolidation, but it's all owned and operated by different people. It's private equity, and it's very much this kind of, the Cellnex type model. And you get service companies on top of that don't really own any assets at all. And then who are the best service companies in the world? Who does that well? It isn't the telcos, is it?
No, and it's so hard.
It's the internet companies.
It's so hard to suddenly adopt a new core competence. And there's other examples of this. Like this isn't a segment for this chat, but a story that we just put up today about Amazon making loads of job cuts. So we did chat last week about Meta making loads of job cuts. I found Elon Musk amusing because he's just, now that he owns the whole thing, he's just gone to people. Right, okay, either you basically sign up for whatever I do or you fuck off. Which just makes me laugh. I mean, obviously I wouldn't be laughing if I was a Twitter person, because the problems with working for Elon Musk is he's apparently a real workaholic and sleeps at his desk and that sort of thing. And he's basically going, if I'm going to do it, you're going to do it, and if you don't like it, you can have 3 months and you can go and moan on Reddit or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're all letting people go, and then Amazon apparently is letting people go, but not necessarily, because I mean the table that you collect that I made reference to I think a couple of pods ago. Amazon's got a disproportionate headcount, but of course a hell of a lot of those
warehouse staff
are like 0 hours sort of delivery people and warehouse people and that sort of thing.
Sorry, going back to Twitter, did you see the whole backlash of the blue tick?
Tell me.
They had those companies like Coca-Cola with the tick saying we're going to put cocaine back in Coke,
right?
And then
because people buy a blue tick and then
Lockheed Martin lost the stock went down like the equivalent of like 5 billion because they said they would pause the shipment of whatever to these countries until they're...
And those are all spoofs,
yeah.
Yeah.
All it took was like buying the blue tick.
I know. Well, actually, on that tangent, because it's quite a fun tangent, it's so hard to work out when someone like Elon Musk gets control of something as conspicuous and prominent as Twitter, and he brings his weird Elon Musky sort of Musk to it. Yeah, he brings his Musk to it. And you're inclined to give him the benefit of that because he's not just a really smart guy, but he's obviously a very successful businessman and by some measures the richest man in the world. Although I'm sure there's some people in Saudi Arabia who'd push back on that. But then he seems to do these incredibly clumsy, weird things. And you think, is it 4D chess? Is he being really clever? Or is he just short of time and just winging it and just can't be fucked to give it proper thought? Yeah. Or does he have too much belief in himself? I mean, that can happen. Is there hubris? Is he just thinking, I'm Elon goddamn Musk, I can do what I want, and then he tries stuff and it turns out to be bollocks? A sort of Trumpy type of level of self-belief.
Yeah.
He's just said he's going to run for president again.
I know. That'll
be fun. Poor Americans. If in 2 years' time you got to choose between Biden and... Do you know, actually, further tangent, I was listening to a podcast and someone was playing some footage of Biden talking... I think someone had asked him like a really important, serious question, like what if Putin started lobbing nukes about? And he actually gave quite a coherent, statesman-like answer. And I realised that much as I love taking the piss out of him for being old and soft in the head, I thought, thank God. Thank God the bloke who's in charge of the states is capable of giving a serious answer to this very serious question.
Some unhinged lunatic in, isn't it, instead? And I'm not necessarily saying that Trump was that. I know he gets made out to be that. But...
He certainly doesn't seem that bad when it comes to wars. He's got plenty of other... but you never know. He might just wake up one morning and just go...
Well, that's the worry,
kiss my ass.
because he gives that impression out. The way he
you just never know.
acts and the things
and that's the parallel I have with Musk. You just don't know. He seems so capricious. You don't know what mood he's going to be in. Anyway, how did we get onto that? I think we were just
talking about job cuts generally.
Generally. Oh yeah, that's right. And he's been cutting jobs, and Amazon's cutting a bunch of jobs, and that's how I got onto it. Core competence, and maybe this applies to Musk as well, because his core competence is electric cars and satellites.
Yeah,
but not necessarily social media networks. Amazon's cutting a bunch of people, largely from their sort of devices and sort of more peripheral services thing. So they're basically going, all right, times are tough, as they are for everyone. But what's telling is what they choose to cut.
Yeah.
And what Amazon chooses to cut is things like, they've always been a mess when it comes to their Fire branded devices. I remember writing about their Fire phone when I just got this job, and I was previously a smartphone analyst, so I felt quite qualified to talk about it. And they came up with a phone that's basically the price of an iPhone, but it wasn't even full-fat Android, because they tried to fork Android, and when you fork Android, Google goes, okay, you can't have the Play Store then, motherfucker. And so, a bit like what's happened to Huawei recently.
So whole stuff about Android being open source. It
is open source, but in so much as you can have a basic Android build, but if you want all the Google special sauce on top of it, then no.
Yeah,
then you're in Google's hands.
There's a catch.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so that was a car crash, and I don't think many people buy the Fire tablet, even though it's a loss leader, because you can get them for about £100 or something.
Yeah.
And the Kindles probably pay for themselves, but I think, it speaks volumes that they've decided to cut down on that bit. And the common theme being core competence. Yeah. Amazon's core competence was initially just being very good at offering and delivering a bunch of shit to people on the internet.
Yeah.
And then secondarily, and more importantly now, very good at offering cloud services to businesses.
Yeah.
But making devices is not a core competence, and I think it's telling that they've cut on that. And so back to the phone. This is how I got onto this tangent. The phone, what is their core competence? Sadly, it's just providing connectivity.
Yeah.
I mean, much hard as they try, every time. Vodafone's a classic example. I talk about Vodafone 360 when they tried to. This is about 10 years or so ago. They tried to make a really hard push into services and other kinds of consumer brands. And that was a car crash. They've done other missteps like buying Mannesmann back about, was it 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's going back a while.
But that was really expensive. That was, I think, the biggest M&A in the world at the time. Yeah. And they tried bits and bobs, and BT, as we chatted about with Neil last week, he gave a decent defence of their sort of sport stuff, but I thought even with him putting his best foot forward, I wasn't blown away by that. I think he
probably looks at it in a different way, though, from how, he's sort of heavily involved in how it all runs and how it all works, and he probably
as opposed to the commercialisation.
Yeah, and I can understand someone like him saying it was really great and it worked really well, because from an experience perspective,
you talk about the Olympics and stuff.
I think they did do a good job from an experience perspective on some of the stuff they've done, and it's all very slick and works well. But commercially, obviously, it was a bit of a disaster, because you're spending so much money on these sports rights, aren't you? And you're competing against companies like Netflix these days that have huge content catalogs,
Sky,
and it's just
and Amazon. Yeah.
Nobody can do it. Let's be honest. It's not necessarily that BT
feels a bit hubristic,
wrong.
Doesn't it?
It's just this is the problem, I think, with you looking at them. Exactly what you just said. They're connectivity companies, but I don't think it's necessarily because they get people on board who are. The thing always gets made out that they're slow moving and they don't really understand other industries and they're a bit crap, aren't they? And I'm not always sympathetic towards that. I just think that they don't have the resources to be able to compete against a company that employs 1.6 million people and makes God knows what in. Actually, Amazon's not hugely profitable, isn't it? All of its profits come from cloud, but. You know what I'm talking about.
It still makes a loss on e-tail.
They're 2 trillion companies, aren't they? That in terms of their market cap, the amount they spend on R&D each year is ridiculous. Yeah. And it's like anything they want to go after, they can chuck so much at it that it'll be very, very hard for anybody else to possibly. And they have some of the brainiest people on the planet. So you go and try and, like, this is exactly what we said about Vodafone, go and try and get 6,000 software engineers into your company these days when everybody wants software engineers.
And they go, hold on, aren't you that phone company?
They'll go, I mean, if they don't want to work for a Google or a Facebook, because those companies are now perceived to be the incumbents themselves in a way, they probably want to go and do a startup, don't they? Like something really innovative. And I know there's some telcos that have had
or work for a startup. Yeah.
Well, that's one interesting thing, is telcos trying to have oversight of startups. Deutsche Telekom did this, I remember, a few years ago. And they're still sort of involved in this. They have these incubator programs where they, Hubraum, I think it's called, they have a sort of small companies in Berlin that they support, and they're not really involved at all. They're very much run at a kind of arm's length basis, and they provide some support, and they'll set them up with meetings, because obviously Deutsche Telekom is very well connected in Germany business wise, and they provide some funding, but you just get on with what you're doing. And the idea is not to constrain innovation and not to kind of interfere culturally in the way that telcos are criticised for doing. And yet I don't see anything having come out of those Hubraum, or whatever it's called, initiatives that's really sort of taken the world by storm. They've not produced another Uber or something like that, for instance.
No, and they get involved in all sorts of... And from the other side, I feel like I'm constantly writing about little either publicly funded or other incubator things that they all get involved in. I think there was a recent one with BT where they get involved with drones in ports. Yeah. So they could spy on everyone and make sure it's all going according to plan. I don't know. I mean... I don't know what the answer is. I'm not I don't, and I don't want to be too much of a downer. And by the way, before we finish, and I'm going to have to move it on from here because we're running out of time. We're still on the first segment.
I was going to say something about Nick Reed.
Oh, go on then. Yeah, go on.
Because I think he seems like a nice bloke and everything. He's quite chatty, and I bet he's the kind of guy you can have a drink with, and but he just. It almost sounds a bit rude to say it, but he's not very inspirational as a figure, is he? He's not, I think this is one of the things that a lot of telcos lack. They don't have these visionary leaders. I mean, we were chatting about Elon Musk earlier. Yeah. Whatever you think of him and what he's doing with Twitter at the moment, he is a kind of attention grabbing, I've got big ideas about doing this, I've got big ideas about colonising Mars, and I'm going to build electric vehicles, and I'm going to have this company called...
he's an outlier, but I take your point.
But you can have, it doesn't even have to be that extreme. You look at some of the internet innovators over the last 20 years. Telecom doesn't really have anything like that, does it? And I think Nick Reed is very much on the opposite end of the scale. He comes across as being quite wonkish, I think is the word. Yeah. I think he has an accountancy background. And
he was CFO, wasn't he?
He was CFO. Yeah. And he's very much a kind of managerial figure.
Which is good.
It's
if
good,
what you want is steady as you go.
But they're never gonna shake off this. This is a mismatch for me with this. We're hiring 6,000 software engineers. We want to digitalise and automate and all this stuff. And then you've got Nick Reed on the earnings call talking about, transactions that'll help them pay off debt, and it's just he's not the figure that's going to make them into anything other than a utility to me.
And I think we agree. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we agree that there's time and place for different kinds of CEOs. I think funnily enough,
well, he might be the right figure at the time, and right now in terms of buckling down and battening the hatches. Who knows?
Just like we've ended up politically with Rishi Sunak, because you figure, he's a sort of not. He's a fairly predictable part of the establishment, and he'll just he'll behave in a predictable way, and I think the market's punished us for being unpredictable with Liz Truss. Yeah. As a slight tangent, did you see that on Twitter? Talking about more charismatic CEOs, John Ledger or Leger or whatever the fuck.
I saw he offered him his services.
To Elon Musk, and Elon Musk just went nah.
I think he took it well, didn't he? Sort of went, "Oh, that's a pretty swift rejection" or something.
Something like that. Well, but anyway, one thing I just wanted to finish off on, if that's all right. Yeah. Is we're characterising operators and operator groups as being not particularly capable of much more than their core competence. Apart from Neil McRae, I don't think we've ever had a senior exec from an operator on, have we? From a big MNO or operator group.
Well, so, you had somebody on from Orange when you were in Barcelona. And I missed that one.
Okay, fair enough.
And we've also had. They're not a traditional telco, but we've had Jeff Hollinghurst on from Rakuten.
Yeah,
I know he's on the symphony side of the business.
So I'm thinking sort of major European or US operator groups.
No.
So if you're listening, Jamie, ex-alumnus, if you want to get someone from Vodafone on, we'd welcome them. Same goes for VM02. Same goes for 3. All that sort of thing. And by the way, while you're at it, stop doing Christmas piss-ups on a Tuesday. What the fuck's that all about? Trying to get me to come into London and get mashed on a Tuesday and put me on my heels for the rest of the week.
I'm viewing that as my last 2 weeks before I disappear for the whole.
Well, who is it? I think it's VMO2 and 3 have done Tuesday piss-ups, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then BT's on a Wednesday.
Yes.
I mean, what's going on?
It's more expensive to hire.
No one's going to be working at that time of the year anyway.
I will be.
Yeah, anyway. You're the only one.
So that's but seriously, if any of you are listening, it'd be great to have them on and tell us why we're wrong. Tell us why we're wrong to sort of pigeonhole operators as being telcos as being incapable of anything more than slow and steady.
I don't think it's just telcos. I actually think most other organisations don't do a very good job of diversifying themselves either.
Like Amazon with devices, or
I would say that's true. That the internet companies haven't always gone into other things that well, but if anybody can do diversification, they've done it better than your average company.
Well, they're better at that cliched fail fast thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is part of it's down to tech and them having this sort of CI/CD, whatever you want to call it, fail fast, DevOps type stuff,
agile,
which is geared up very well to be able to do that. But I think part of it's just resources.
God, people don't go on about DevOps so much these days, do they?
No, they don't. I think a lot of it's just resources. It's if you've got that much money you can throw at something, you can crowd anybody out pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You can disrupt any.
So they can afford to fail.
They can afford to fail. They can come after anybody in a traditional,
because they've got these enormous cash cows in their core business.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
So it's not a level playing field, and again, that sort of says operators stop trying to go toe to toe with them because you're going to lose.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them would say they're not anymore. But then if they're not,
what are they doing?
What are they doing? What's
left for them?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's
totally
the problem, because they're coming into your sector. So, yeah.
I hear you. Right. Okay. Let's move it on. Just in the name of time management. Which I'm notoriously bad at. So I wrote a thing yesterday. It was one of those ones. I'm actually trying to write more stuff that's like what you write, Ian, to us. And sometimes I see, like, especially on a Monday, I see the thing you've put up, and I read some of the points you make in the arguments. I was like, that's the shit we talked about on the podcast. And I'm sure it was stuff that was already in your head, but maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe chatting about it on the podcast sort of crystallised some of your thoughts.
Totally,
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think those are really good, and it's hard. It's really hard to differentiate yourself as a journalist just covering news, because there's a million other people covering the same news.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to write more of that sort of thing, and that's basically my excuse for writing sort of more opinionated, ranty stuff. And I put one up sort of late yesterday. Ofcom have come up with. This is something I've spoken about many times on the pod before. We've got a thing going on in the UK right now. There's this online safety bill, which I view, as someone who's very anti censorship and very anti sort of power grabs, at least sly, underhand, sort of concealed power grabs. The online safety bill I had a real problem with, because they had things like, we want to find a way of banning legal but harmful content. Now, what the fuck is the government doing trying to get involved in banning stuff that's legal? I mean, the government uniquely has mechanisms for banning stuff, which is called the law. If you want to ban something, make it illegal. Don't use Ofcom as a proxy to censor stuff that you can't be fucked to try and run through the normal legal due process or parliamentary due process and make it legal. So that was one of my biggest issues with that. And then Ofcom sent a press release yesterday. It was titled, "Who controls the news we see online?" ? Which is a classic begging the question. You think, well, why are they asking that question?
A bit loaded, that one.
They're presumably not happy with who controls it. Otherwise, they wouldn't ask the question. And they basically got... Their point was there's too much control over what we see online from these big tech, principally Google, Facebook, Twitter, and anyone else who controls the flow of information on the internet. One of their big issues seems to be that increasingly people now get their news from the internet rather than when we were kids, where people would all sit down and watch 9 o'clock news.
So it's being served to you rather than you.
Well, there's that push versus pull aspect as well. But you're like half a generation younger than us. I don't know how you view these things. Do you, Pierre? Do you watch like news bulletins or read national newspapers, or do you get most of your news? I mean, I know you're not massively obsessed with current affairs. I mean, that's to your credit, by the way. But
it's too depressing.
I remember once I went on a trip with Pierre. It was just me and him, and I was trying to make some conversation. I was banging on about this, that, and Pierre just looked at me and went, "Scott, I don't really care." And I was just like, "Okay, fair enough. I'll shut up." I mean, what am I doing? Trying to impose whatever bugbear I've got on him. But anyway, what news you do consume, where do you think you get it from?
I guess I watch like BBC clips on YouTube. So although it is on YouTube, it's still from the BBC.
Right, okay. Like people like that guy, Ross Atkins, who does those little summaries, things like that.
Yeah, just like, there's always like when I browse YouTube, there's always like a whole strip of like thumbnails of like current affairs.
And what about like you use Reddit in a way that I don't? Do you just...
Yeah, but Reddit they always push like insider articles and business insider. It's always like
it's become a bit biased, does it?
Yeah.
Well, every source becomes biased. See, this is one of the things, like back to this story I'm going to talk about, one of the things that Ofcom I don't think understands. So they're worried. So their superficial worry, their stated worry is that people are getting their information from gatekeepers, such as Facebook and Google, and that might be skewing the sort of public discussion, which in one way is a legitimate concern. But one issue I've got with that concern is that's always the case with newspapers. I mean, if you only read The Guardian, you're only getting quite a leftist point of view. If you only read Telegraph, you're only getting quite a rightist point of view. So these gatekeepers, these biased gatekeepers have always been there. It just strikes me that one of their concerns is that the gatekeepers are now beyond their control, because if they want to put pressure on The Guardian, Ofcom's got and Parliament have got all sorts of mechanisms. Yeah. But I also think the thing they don't take account of is like what maybe you do, what you were just expressing through Reddit, is as soon as we're all intelligent, we're all discerning, we're all capable of working out whether people are trying to brainwash us. And if one source, like I found this with YouTubers, I've had certain YouTubers that sorry, I'm meandering a little bit here. No. I've had a couple of beers. I've had some YouTubers that over time, that I used to be really keen on, and over time I think they've been guilty of a thing that's known as audience capture.
Yeah, in their bubble.
Yeah, and so they start.
This works, I'll do more of that. Yeah,
this works, I'll do exactly. This works, I'll do more of that. And then you get more and more of it. Like two YouTubers that I quite enjoy who I think are guilty of this.
Don't say BS.
BS. No. I was going to say Dave Rubin and Tim Pool.
Oh, yeah.
Who's BS?
Shapiro.
Oh, Ben Shapiro. Well, no, but Ben Shapiro is not actually a good example, because Ben Shapiro's bias is overt.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know, this is one of the reasons I don't like to look at usage stats, readership stats on the website.
Yeah, because you don't want it to affect.
And I've started doing it a bit recently, and already I can see that it's making me think, oh, well, I wrote that thing, I should do more of that.
Quite, that's audience capture.
I don't think it's a good thing to do. Because
I think you could do a little bit of it, but not too
once
much.
You start doing it, you find yourself, I need to look at what the top stories are like this yesterday. Because
and maybe I'll write another thing.
Maybe I'll do another one. And it's like, yeah, all right, you should have an idea of what your audience is interested in. I'm not saying that, but you've got to be quite careful about. It's very hard. It's very easy to get down that sort of into that habit of I did this one thing and everybody liked it, therefore I'm going to do more and more of that. And then you stop doing things that are actually really interesting that you could build the readership in as well.
We can completely understand the temptation, and you end up narrowing your audience, and it ultimately becomes self-defeating. I think like American mainstream media have become guilty of that. Like CNN, MSNBC are fairly overtly pro-Democrat,
and they lose on half of the audience.
Yeah.
Same thing for Fox News.
Yeah, and then Fox News did a bit, although Fox News got a bit more lukewarm, and then the more Trumpy people end up going to places like sort of Newsmax and OAN. Anyway, what was my point? So So basically, these gatekeepers have always been there. But I think what happens with online, and I suspect you do this, Pierre, and I certainly do, is if someone gets too audience captured, like I find, I'll listen to Ben Shapiro, but with Ben Shapiro, I know I'm getting the rightist, quite sort of, he's religiously orthodox, he's Orthodox Jew. There's going to be certain things like in terms of social policy, like marriage and that sort of thing, where he's going to come from. But it's all right, I'll listen to him, but he'll just be my one little dose from that side of the spectrum. And then I'll have a few others, and I'll listen to, I was listening to a podcast from another US journalist called Barry Weiss on the way in, and she's...
Great singer.
Yeah. She's actually made that joke about herself.
Oh, it's a woman? Okay.
Yeah, Barry. She's Bari.
Ah, okay.
But yes, her surname does mean white in German, doesn't it? And she's leans leftist, and so you get her, and then you plug that in. But it does require a lot of time. You've got to be someone like me who's prepared to listen to these things, and I listen to podcasts while I'm playing computer games or when I'm travelling in.
If no one's in the middle, you have to make your own you've got Play-Doh mix of color.
Totally. You've got to sort of manufacture it yourself. But then maybe to give them credit, Ofcom, maybe they're worried about the people who don't really engage that much, and they just dip into the internet, let's say half an hour a day, when they get up in the morning and they look at their phone and go, what was Twitter say?
Yeah, and it's always the same half.
Yeah, but I still think, so that's one of my concerns about Ofcom's, my more superficial concern about Ofcom's position is I think it's disingenuous. I think they've always been biased. There's always been gatekeepers. People have always been influenced. But I think if we think of Ofcom as a proxy for the political establishment, which they increasingly are, because this Tory government has given Ofcom loads of censorship powers that they never had before. Yeah. Ofcom used to just be looking at BT and Vodafone and shit.
Yeah,
and now they're increasingly looking at online content.
I think they're talking total bullshit, to be quite honest.
Right, yeah, go on. I've been ranting for a while.
I think the news market is more diverse now than it's ever been. And your point about if you only read The Guardian, you only get a left-wing view of the world.
But it's still not a bad paper.
Yeah, of course, but you go back to the 1940s and 1950s or whatever, when you only had The Guardian and The Times and whatever and a few others. You think your average Guardian reader then was also going out and picking up, or your average Sun reader going out and picking up, reading all the other newspapers to get a rounded view of what's going on in the world? Of course they fucking weren't. They were just reading The Guardian and getting a left-wing view of things, which is why politics has always, things have always been quite polarised. I think the difference now is there's a lot more of it. There's a lot more of these organisations in the mix. So there's all sorts of little partisan groups now, rather than just one big Labour group, one big Conservative. You're left wing, you read The Guardian. You're right wing, you read The Times. Now you've got loads and loads of different interest groups because all the online players are active and in the mix as well. And yeah, sure, people in social media, they're in their own little echo chambers and they only pay attention to what goes on there. But frankly, that goes on with Guardian readership as well.
You look at a columnist like Owen Jones in The Guardian, he's clearly audience captured and playing to the crowd.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not to say that he's not a good writer and his opinions aren't valid, but, it's very focused.
I used to read The Guardian when I was at university. I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole these days, frankly. I do actually look in The Guardian because I try and have a rounded view.
because it's the best free...
It's probably one of the best free ones. Like you say,
it's about the only broadsheet that's free.
That is one of the reasons I look at it. You can't get into the Times, the Telegraph, and the FT anymore without getting through their paywalls. And because they're so clunky and they haven't adapted in the same way telcos haven't, you can't just go and... I mean, if they had a system where you could go and look at one article, let's say, and do a micropayment, then I'd be willing to do that occasionally, actually, because I want to look at the odd telecom article, for instance, the FT does. What I usually do with the FT is you can jimmy it. You go onto Google.
Well, Ian, I shouldn't be saying this on camera, but I've got an FT account, so... Get back to me offline.
Well, the easier way actually with the FT is I don't seem to have realised that on your mobile phone you can look it up in Google and then just click on it and go straight.
Oh, that was always the classic way of circumventing paywalls.
So I found it easy to circumvent them all the time.
Well, just let me know if you need a bit of help.
I suspect nobody from the FT is watching this and is about to change it. Who deals with that side of things. So
before I know it, they go, ha ha.
I'm not going to be too worried. Yeah. But and I'm not doing anything illegal by doing that, by the way. That's just the way it works. So I can still get into the FT, but. Yeah, so you can get into The Guardian without having to worry about things like that, and they don't charge you. So I do look at it from time to time.
They just beg you for money every now and then.
Yeah, but those little kind of, as I say, when I was a student and I only read The Guardian and I got my view of the world from that, and I was never going to go out and buy The Telegraph because that wasn't a studenty thing to do, and I was probably more left-wing in those days than I am now. I probably had a very sort of weird view of the world, actually, because you're not exposed to other news, and it's the same. It's exactly the same as somebody just looking at.
That's the stated concern of Ofcom, and I think you're agreeing with me, which is that.
I mean, they could have got
involved. 'Twas ever
thus.
thus.
Exactly. It's like, but they seem to be. This seems to tie in with their beef with big tech to me.
Well, quite. Well, this is what I was leading up to, but you go ahead.
They had this cloud computing thing a few weeks ago, I remember Ofcom as well. Like, we need to look into the cloud computing market and see if it's too concentrated in the UK because the three big players have an 80% market share. Well, of course it's too bloody concentrated. It's, we've been talking about that for probably a couple of years now, I think. But they've got a sort of thing, a bee in their bonnet about big tech, and as a lot of people have, and therefore anything you can throw at big tech and any accusation you can come up with and any way you can target them and have a go at them is sort of fair game. And I mean, I think this whole net neutrality thing ties in with that, to be quite honest with you.
Well, and my fear, it sounds a little bit tinfoil hatty, but I'll stand by it. My feeling is a lot of the attacks on big tech are related to this news content and public opinion side of it, because from when I've been looking at it, it originated, and I mentioned this in my story that I put up yesterday. The first time I saw evidence of this was after the 2016 elections. Remember, there was a double electoral sort of seismic shift in 2016. There was Brexit and there was Trump. And for the establishment, the Brexit was bad, and for the establishment, Trump was obviously bad.
Yeah.
And then soon after that, we got that Cambridge Analytica story. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And that was, funnily enough, from a Guardian journalist. Where it was basically, and it was such an obvious storm in a teacup to start with, because.
By the way, I do think the Guardian does some really good stuff. The whole Edward Snowden thing was top notch.
Well, yeah, I mean,
quality
obviously the heavy lifting was done by Glenn Greenwald on that, but yeah, they still published it.
But they did, and they've done other things on the Panama Papers and all that stuff.
Totally,
they've done some really good things.
I'm not here to slag off the Guardian.
But they're clearly opinion-wise and analysis-wise, they're very left-wing, and I think if you just read that stuff, you get a very skewed view of the world.
And on day-to-day politics, they're likely to have a shittier stance on the Tories than Labour, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, Cambridge Analytica, the big story of Cambridge Analytica was that this company is basically doing some data mining and offering insights via Facebook to help targeted political marketing. That was it. And that was held up as this big, oh my God.
Yeah.
Whereas targeted political marketing has presumably happened since the dawn of time. The fact that it was using slightly novel social media tools to do so, I thought was unremarkable. And then, of course, there were these inferences that it was basically sort of sinister Russian influences and all that sort of thing. And the Russian angle was obviously played very heavily with Trump, which again has been completely debunked.
Russians.
Well, I mean, it's hard to defend the Russians at the moment. But Cambridge Analytica was basically debunked as a theory. The Trump-Russian collusion was debunked as a theory. But the reason I'm bringing them up is that was the first time I saw how much the establishment, however you want to define it, I've got a sense in my mind of what the establishment is. Think Rishi Sunak. How the establishment was pissed off at the 2016 thing that's happening, and they realised that they'd lost a lot of control over the public narrative. And the reason they'd lost a lot of control over the public narrative is because people were getting more of their news and opinion and electoral preferences from social media than they're getting from mainstream media, which, while they can't control it, I'm not saying the Guardian can be controlled by politicians or the Times or the Telegraph or whatever, but they can lean on them. Yeah. And they at least have got that one throat to choke thing. They know that they can lean on Rupert Murdoch or they can lean on whoever owns the Guardian.
Yeah, well, they can't do anything about these guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what I think this was really about. That's the essence of my piece that I wrote yesterday, is that I think Ofcom, and I think Ofcom is increasingly a proxy of the government now. They try and put in these little caveats like going, well, of course, all we can do is make recommendations for the government. But then previously the government said we're giving Ofcom powers of censorship themselves.
More like the FCC.
Yeah, maybe. And I think I wrote a bit where there's a sort of closed loop where they pass the ball backwards and forwards to each other. Ofcom goes, well, it's over to the government, and then the government goes, well, we'll do what Ofcom says, and Ofcom goes, well, we'll just recommend. And basically there's just this closed loop, but they can launder their positions by saying they're just following the advice of someone else. Yeah. And I'm just not buying it. I think it's all bollocks. What they're really trying to do is regain some control over the public political debate because they feel they've lost it. I think it's good that they've lost it. I think they probably have lost it. It's good they've lost it. I think, yes, there is some collateral damage. Some people go down some fucked up rabbit holes and start believing all kinds of crazy shit.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the concern shouldn't be that the news is controlled by Google. To me, and it's not something that Ofcom should necessarily intervene in. I think there's a sort of qualitative issue there, really, with people getting their news from social media. But this is more.
Well, that's part of the point that Ofcom was making.
This is more me sticking up for my profession, I think, more than anything, perhaps, because I think those papers that I've just referred to, whatever you think of them, on where they sit on the political spectrum, they do employ proper journalists who know what they're doing, and they're going around and they dig out stories, and they're in the country where it's happening, and they're on the feet on the ground, and they go knock on doors, and rather than some Twitter blogger or something who who isn't paid to do what he's doing.
But having said that, and I'm not criticizing you, and I'm sure you won't totally disagree.
I'm not saying
but sometimes citizen journalists do a job that regular journalists
don't take that as those people should be clamped down on and censored. I'm not saying that's the answer, but I think it's a bit worrying that it's more of an education thing for me, actually. Like, if we don't engage young people with the importance of news, and I mean, your son's a similar age to mine. Yeah. And I've sort of been trying to get Rafa before he went to the US to university to sort of take more of an interest in current affairs by reading The Spectator or The Economist each week, which are my two main things.
Exactly what I did to Jack for a while.
Because they're quite different politically, those two magazines. So you do get quite a rounded view when you read them. And if you do that, and you also read the BBC, let's say, and a few of these online sites that whether it's a blogger or whether it's a newspaper or whether it's a YouTuber, I think you get around. If you're interested in current affairs and want to know what's going on in the world, and both my kids will go, well, what's going on in Russia at the moment? Why is this thing happening in Ukraine from time to time? It's like, well, those are the things I recommend. But I don't think a lot of parents do that. I think they just sort of...
Well, I tried with Jack, and Jack even did things like history and politics for A-level. But he's 18 and he's just not that bothered at the moment. And to be honest,
but he might be when he gets into his 20s. I mean, I wasn't actually when I was 18. I can't claim to be.
You can't force feed these things.
No. I didn't know shit when I was 18 about what was going on in the world. I'd be perfectly honest to put my hand up and say I didn't really know.
I didn't even care.
I thought I did, but I didn't. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s really that I started to take more of an interest in what's going on. So you're still a teenager at that age, but maybe that's the worry, is because everything's quite skewed by the fact that young people nowadays have... I didn't even have access to information when I was 15, 16, Like, I'd read my dad's newspaper then, and that was the Telegraph, because that's what he's always got. If I was going to read anything at all, probably more often I was reading a novel if I was reading, and not getting any news. So, whereas nowadays, kids have smartphones, they have access to the internet, they have access to the world of information.
Yeah, and they're on social media, and they might have a TikToker going, fucking hell, Putin, what are you playing at, bro?
But maybe that's better than not knowing anything at all. I was totally in the dark. You're getting a skewed view, but they're not totally ignorant. So my ultimate point, and this is always my point about censorship, is who decides. We can all understand how censorship might be desirable, because we can't have people getting the wrong idea and getting led astray, and they use these shifty terms like misinformation and disinformation and malinformation and other suffixes or prefixes for information. But who decides what's good information and what's bad information? No one can decide. And the problem is, as soon as someone is given the power to decide, they're given an awful lot of power. And so then it becomes back to a concentration of power thing. Yeah. If I get to decide what's good information, and you on this pod go, well, Scott, I read this, and I go, nah, I'm giving that a thumbs down. Yeah. You can't talk about that, Ian. I've decided because I'm the geezer in charge of all this. That's too much power for me to have. And that's too much power for anyone to have, because information, as I think we've all just been discussing, people just get it from a plurality of sources. Oh, that's a word to try after you've had a couple of beers. Plurality. And then we make our own mind up.
and it might be wrong, but who's to say what's right? So that's the thing. I mean, I've got, so I'll move on to the final segment because we're running out of time. I'll just read my final paragraph of what for me is a fairly lengthy piece. For you was probably quite a short piece. I said, rather than try and win over the public by simply being more competent, this is me assuming that Ofcom is acting on the whims of the government, and I do think the two are umbilically joined. Rather than try and win over the public by simply being more competent, it seems the government rather twice. I hate it when actually sometimes I read my stuff out and I self-proof live on the podcast. I got rather twice in the same sentence. Anyway, I'll start from the top. Rather than try to win over the public by simply being more competent, it seems the government would rather try to control the flow of information to better suit its own agenda. It's probably too much to hope that Ofcom might recommend, this is me making reference back to Ofcom saying all it can do is recommend to the government. It's probably too much to hope that Ofcom might recommend the government look to itself before blaming US tech companies for the contempt in which it's held by the electorate. But a move to force those, and this is another thing, I did make the point that one area in which I do have sympathy with the Ofcom position is transparency. I think it would be nice to know, like, for example, on Facebook, my dad uses Facebook a lot.
Yeah.
And he's constantly moaning about how half the time he can't see shit I put up.
Right.
And so the curation and the filtering and the prioritization of the feed is very frustrating. And it's not transparent. And one thing Ofcom said that I do agree with, before you think I'm just having a go the whole time, Ofcom, if anyone from there is listening, I do agree with the transparency angle. It'd be nice to know, A, how they make these decisions, and B, to have a switch that just goes, no, I'll have pure chronological, thank you very much, which I think is available on Twitter. That was my phone. Pure chronological. That's all I want. I don't want any curation. I don't want you picking shit you think I like. I just want the most recent thing that someone on my friends list put up on that. Anyway, so that the final bit, I said, but a move to force those companies into giving individuals greater control over their news feeds could well provide a political win too. My point being there that if they were a bit more clever, the government wouldn't just try and censor, it would just try and empower individuals, but hopefully get some political capital from that.
Yeah.
Which they very rarely do. I just don't, I know I'm coming from a certain direction politically, but I just don't see politicians say, hello, I've empowered you more, individual, that's why you should vote for me. Even the Tory party were supposed to be the ones who do that.
Yep.
So, yeah, okay. If that's all right, I'll move it on from there onto crypto, the small matter of crypto.
Pierre.
Yeah, to you, Pierre. So I'll frame it. I'll frame it very quickly. With the caveat that none of us really know what the fuck we're talking about, but I'm the one who suggested this topic, so I might as well just run with it.
Start from the beginning.
First
there were computers,
and then the Lord said, "Let there be light." So crypto in its essence, my understanding of cryptocurrency is twofold. Firstly, it's an alternative to sort of state-run fiat currency, and fiat currency means currency that is no longer tied to a physical asset. So until whenever, I don't know when the great crossover happened, but money used to be a promissory note. It basically used to mean that this note is equivalent to this amount of gold or this amount of actual physical asset. You had to have gold
reserves, didn't you, to back it up?
You had to back it up.
Yeah.
And then fiat, again, this is all very sketchy, and anyone who's listening to this who wants to tell me I'm full of shit, feel free.
So actually, the whole concept of fiat money itself is pretty dodgy.
Well, indeed, it is.
It's just bits of paper floating around.
Yeah, that are no longer tied to physical assets.
And it's not even that anymore, because it's just in your bank account as a series of zeros and ones.
And we've seen that. One of the reasons we're in this inflationary fuckery that we're doing now is that it's things like quantitative easing, which is basically them digitally printing money.
Yeah, but it's not really printing, it's just generating...
Printing's just an allegory. All they're doing is just sticking some more numbers in a spreadsheet or whatever. Anyway, but then cryptocurrency, as typified by Bitcoin, was supposed to be an alternative to that, another way of exchanging value. Because, I mean, you talk about starting from the beginning. What is money? What money is
Is there a God?
I know. Pierre's like, I wish I hadn't said that now. He's looking at his watch. I've got to pick my kids up. What is actually money? Money is basically a way of turning labour into a liquid, transferable form. So we do our labour, writing stories, doing this podcast, answering emails, whatever. And Informa says that we value your labour at this amount, which is obviously far less than we deserve. And no, not really.
I always try and boil it back to my wife's village.
Okay.
Because that's the closest I can think to as being a place where you still see people go and like. So my father-in-law was like sort of almost like the village factotum. You know, people bring things to him to be mended, and he's got his little workshop downstairs.
Okay, I don't know that term, factotum.
And they'll come over and they'll go, you know, can you fix my bike, or can you sort of do something with this device that I've messed up? And he generally can. And in return they'll bring him like like some black puddings.
I see. So there's a more bartery type of thing. But he's basically exchanging his labour for a black pudding.
But then you sort of think, well, it's very inconvenient and inefficient, isn't it? It'd be easier if they just came over with a note saying, there we go. You can do, if I give you this note, then you can go and use it, not with me, but you can go and actually buy.
Yeah, so it's about liquidity
down the road.
Money's about liquidity.
And I guess that's how it first came into being.
I always think when I tried to explain sort of basic economics to my kids, I was like, let's say you're a caveman. You could be a subsistence caveman and just go out and hunt saber-toothed tigers or whatever, or you could go one level up and you could start also being a hunter-gatherer, or you could start to grow crops, or you could add value and you could chop down trees, but not just sell that lumber, but fashion that lumber into, let's say, a chair, and then your labour that's gone into making that chair means that the lumber is suddenly worth 10 times more than it would have been just as a plank, and so on. Anyway, I just think people sometimes maybe don't think enough about what money actually is. Yeah. And it's a form of, primarily, as I view it, labour liquidity. And so going back to crypto, the point of crypto is another form of liquidity. And one of the appeals of it is that it wasn't controlled by governments or big corporations, and it's underpinned by this thing called blockchain, which is a distributed ledger that I don't really understand. I'm certainly not going to get down that rabbit hole. But the point of it is supposed to be that it's self-regulating.
Decentralisation.
Yeah, it's decentralised, it's self-regulating. It just takes care of itself.
Yeah. Which is total bullshit in itself, of course, because the people who talk up blockchain and decentralisation, and I think even Jack Dorsey now is talking. There's a suggestion that there's this Twitter alternative that's based on these principles of Web 3.0, and it's decentralised and no one really is in control. But there's always somebody there trying to make money out of it. He wants to control it. There's always somebody backing it. But the two things, in its defence, the two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have, from my very limited understanding of how blockchain and distributed ledgers work, you can have something that is self-maintaining, that is totally distributed, totally decentralised, and you can have that, and then you can still have other people who are good at exploiting that opportunity and all that sort of thing. And that's the problem, though, isn't it? Because the idea of trying to decentralise it is that you take that sort of concern out of the equation, but there's always somebody there who.
Well, quite,
and what's happened with what you're going to get onto is clearly evidence of that.
So there we are. So like, without doing the history of crypto, which I'm ill-qualified to do. So that's got us onto why crypto is popular, and blockchain and Bitcoin seems to have its own thing, which, according to a podcast I listened to recently, which is about as much expertise as I can have, still seems to have a fair bit of integrity and legitimacy. But the problem is, as soon as you can create a fiat currency like Bitcoin, someone else can create one. Like we were talking before we started filming, you could have Ian Coin and Pierre Coin and Scott Coin.
We shouldn't have one.
Yeah, sort of podcast coin or Telecoms.com coin or whatever.
Limited edition.
None of these coins are actually useful for anything, by the way.
Well, they're all just notional, aren't they?
I mean, I think there's one country in the world that did
El Salvador.
El Salvador adopted cryptocurrency and allowed you to actually go and buy a bag of groceries with cryptocurrency, and what a disaster,
Exactly.
But nowhere else on the planet can you actually go and buy a Mars bar with Bitcoin.
No, and one of the problems with it is, and one of the reasons,
it's financial speculation, basically.
I completely agree. And that was the thing. While still stressing that I understand why I understand the abstract concept behind it being appealing. In practice, I completely concede your point, Ian, which is it then just became this Wild West for people, for opportunists and speculators and all that sort of thing. Anyway, and Bitcoin, everyone knows that its value's gone up and down. But if it's just Bitcoin and it was just a very volatile asset, for want of a better word, then you think, fine, if people want to take a high risk, if people want to roll the dice, if people want to get at the casino, fair play to them.
Yeah.
But I mean, to research one story I wrote on it, there was some website that just lists all the cryptocurrencies that you can buy, and it's just endless, the list.
Yeah.
So,
which makes the nonsense of the whole thing, because the whole point of this is to get back to the point of the guy in the village you meant to buy. Can you give him a note that he can go use to buy something else? You need some standardization. You need something that everybody accepts for money to be useful, for that system to be useful.
Some agreement.
If you've got a million different forms of
point.
cryptocurrency, then all it's ever going to be is an opportunity for people to do financial speculation.
To fuck about.
And fuck about. And there's no intrinsic value in it there at the end of the day. That's all it is. It's, people complain about there being intrinsic value in much safer assets, actually, but that really is just about financial speculation.
And so then we get onto FTX, headed up by this visionary called Sam Bankman-Fried. Was that his name? SBF for short. What was it? I saw a leftist podcast that I follow called God, I forget the name. Anyway, they called him Sam Bankrun Fraud, which I thought was a good effort. So he had one of the biggest exchanges, and the exchanges is where it all gets even more complicated, because you can have a crypto exchange where they basically act as banks but in a crypto environment, and they let people trade. But just like banks, like we had in 2007-8, where banks got overexposed. And banks in principle, if you go back to I don't know, the Great Depression, banks in principle should only lend what they have in gold bars in their vaults.
Yeah.
But of course, over time, they then go, fuck it, we can lend 10 times that, because no one's going to ask. Everyone's not going to ask for all their shit at once.
Yeah.
But then you get a bank run.
Yeah.
And this seems to have happened with this SBF guy and FTX. But on top of that, he created his own cryptocurrency called FTTs or something. But cut a long story short, and this is me just passing on. I'm no expert, and I certainly won't get sued, although I don't think he's in a position to sue anyone. I think he's legging it right now. I don't know what he did, but it looks like a classic Ponzi scheme, which, if anyone doesn't understand what a Ponzi scheme is, it's basically like a pyramid scheme whereby you pay investors...
With no money coming in.
Yeah, well, no, you pay investors exaggerated returns based on new investors coming in at the bottom. That's why they talk about a pyramid. So the people at the top get paid, but they're not getting paid on actual returns from speculating on markets
they're getting paid on
making
what the people
shit.
At the bottom put in.
Yeah, and as long as people at the bottom keep coming in, you can keep paying the people at the top, and that's a pyramid scheme. Yeah. And then the people at the bottom sift further up. But then at some stage, it's like a game of musical chairs. At some stage, it goes Pete Tong, and the people at the bottom especially are the ones that get fucked.
Yeah.
And that's what seems to have happened with this FTX. But on an order of magnitude that's quite incredible, like tens of billions of dollars, I think.
I think it was, what I read earlier, it was 33, 32?
Yeah.
Now it's bankruptcy.
So it was a Ponzi scheme.
Well... I mean, on one level, I don't want to overcharacterise it. I can't keep stressing enough. I don't really know what I'm talking about.
Like a form of it, let's say.
Yeah, but I'm kind of passing on what I've read. And I do find this stuff interesting. Any high drama in business, as we're business journalists, has got to be of interest.
Yeah.
But it feels like a Ponzi scheme. The question is whether it was always designed as such, where someone like Bernie Madoff seems to have always designed it that way. So the other interesting thing about this SBF character is he's very young. He's still only about 30 or something. And he, at his peak, was a multi-billionaire. Is that he was involved in this movement they call, what was it? Something altruism. Realistic altruism, something like that. No, it's not that. Anyway.
So something that's not altruistic at all, probably.
Well, I was listening to Sam Harris' podcast about it. Some form of altruism where basically... it's meant to be pragmatic, and again, I don't think that's the qualifying word they use. I think it begins with E, but I can't remember what it is. Where they're saying, look, what really works? So maybe an example of someone like that could be Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Where he went off
Yeah.
and he's got zillions of dollars, and then he goes off and looks into malaria and shit like that. And they just think, look, let's
Didn't he start the coronavirus, Scott, to sort of infect everybody?
He used 5G antennas.
And he's exactly.
over 5G
Didn't he
to go
do
full
that?
circle back to telecoms.
Yeah.
Where you earn loads of money, but the reason you earn loads of money is for altruistic reasons. Now, there's a couple of alarm bells that rings. Firstly, I'm a bit sceptical, maybe just because I'm dead inside, about people who claim to be primarily altruistic. I think people are primarily self-serving, or at least, I mean, I spend most of my money on my family. Is that altruistic or is it self-serving? That's a bit of a grey area, isn't it?
Mm. Well, there are some people who don't give a shit about their families.
There we are.
I think
So I'm
it's
more
it's
interested
a
in
happy,
them.
happy medium.
But people who claim like altruism in terms of the world, I'm suspicious of.
Yeah.
And then the other problem with this kind of, I'm going to earn loads of money in order to then be altruistic with all the money I earn, is it creates this sort of...
I think there are some genuine altruists.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
but,
totally.
I mean,
Jeff Bezos' ex-wife.
why they do it? Because
It's easy
you
for
could,
her to be altruistic, isn't it?
if you were going to be very cynical, you could say they're doing it because it makes them feel better about themselves.
Yeah,
but,
totally.
But that's just human nature. Let's
No,
be
it
honest.
could be, and
you
I'm not one of
You don't
these
want to do
people.
something that's going to make you feel shit about yourself, do you? So
No, I'm not one of these people, but I think even the people who need to feel good about themselves in a social way, which I admit I don't, as long as I take care of my family and my mates, society is someone else's problem as far as I'm concerned.
yeah,
And not some people wouldn't admit that. They'd be like, no, I really care about everyone.
yeah.
But I just think even the people who do think they care about everyone, they've still got an order of prioritisation in their minds. They're still going to take care of numero uno first. That's just normal human behaviour.
There are cases of people putting themselves in harm's way though to save strangers.
Well,
and
there's some
that's-
outliers.
that's
Jesus.
not-
Cheers,
I wasn't
Mother
thinking.
Teresa.
I wasn't thinking of Jesus specifically, but there are documented cases of people throwing themselves onto train tracks to get other people out of the way first, probably thinking that they could get back up as
No,
well.
I hear you. There's some outliers that are really,
or soldiers
truly
leaping
selfless.
on bombs, to save the rest of the troop and things like that. I mean, that's hard to explain.
But I don't think. I think they're outliers.
Yeah, probably.
I think most
They probably
people,
are.
and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think most people just take care of themselves first. I mean, we talk about inflation, all that sort of thing. Everyone's shitting themselves about bills.
Yeah.
Of course you're going to worry about paying your own bills before mine. You're not going to go, Scott, I'll tell you what, me and my family, we'll get chucked out of our house just so you're not out of pocket, Scott. Yeah, of course you're going to take care of yourself first.
Yeah.
And that's that's given understanding among friends. That we'll try and help each other out, but we're kind of counting on our mates taking care of their own business first. Anyway, so there's this pragmatic altruism thing, and that was his big shtick. And I think his parents were... and he's the second biggest donor to the Democrat Party behind George Soros.
Right.
So now in the murkier, if you choose to go to Reddit or whatever, in the murkier ends of the internet, maybe you've seen this already, Pierre, there are people hatching all these sort of theories about how he was basically laundering money for the Democrat Party and all that sort of thing. I don't know. I don't want to go there. I don't have any proof one way or the other. But the long and short of it is this person who was apparently motivated by altruistic / political, because I'm afraid if you're the second biggest donor to the Democrat Party, you're political.
Yeah.
There's no
Well, of
two ways
course,
about
yeah.
it. And I think it's highly questionable to think any political party, Democrat Party, Tory Party, Labour Party, Republicans, are necessarily a force for good versus their opponents. I mean, that's just fucking naive.
Yeah.
Or tribal. But so one of the ways in which he's manifested his supposed altruism is by donating a hell of a lot of money to the Democrat Party. And anyway, now it's all, this house of cards has just sort of collapsed. And I think it says it's done damage to two things. It's done damage to crypto on the whole.
Yeah.
And it's done damage to this altruistic movement.
But just on the broader subject of crypto, because it wasn't in a healthy place before this, was it? I mean,
it had a tough year or so.
It's had a bad
but that
year.
probably contributed to it.
Yeah, but the days when, I mean, I remember my son sort of getting into crypto trading.
Did he?
Yeah. And
Steady
at
on.
a bad time, really.
With some of his
when he
winnings
shouldn't
from
have
the
done it.
tennis.
Well, yeah, and my wife was like, oh, there's money to be made because look at what's happened. And I said, no, you've got to be careful about stuff like this. It's all very speculative, but they don't pay attention to me. So so he did it anyway. He didn't lose it. It's not like he lost a huge amount. It's tens
or hundreds. Yeah.
It wasn't even hundreds, I don't think.
Okay.
But it's still like, I I just wonder about the kind of longevity of it, really. Was it a fad, or I don't understand how, getting back to the whole point about how money gets used in a society. To me, I'm not saying that I want things to be centralised and that I think we need, no decentralisation at all. But money for me is one thing where it has to be sort of administered by governments, because
there has
to be some stability, and it has to be something that the whole of society buys into. It has to be one system we agree on.
Look what's happening with even 10%
we have
inflation.
The pound.
We're shitting ourselves.
Europe has the euro.
11.
Everybody buys into these systems. To have a world where there's 1,000 different cryptocurrencies that aren't useful for anything apart from buying and selling and trying to make some money out of, just sounds really fucking unhealthy. I mean, it's no surprise that it's subject to this sort of thing happening, frankly.
Well, I called it an emperor's new clothes moment.
Yeah.
I mean, crypto's not going away, and one of the things, I'm going to wrap it up in a sec anyway, just because we're running out of time. Part of the broader relevance of this, perhaps bring it slightly more back to tech and telecoms, is blockchain on the whole, because blockchain also underpins other things like NFTs, non-fungible tokens.
Oh, that's another thing. It's a total waste of time.
And I think it feels like that to me, but I feel like, the Gartner hype cycle thing, or the chart. So it feels to me like crypto has maybe got to one of those peak hype things, and now we're going to go into that trough of disillusionment.
Yeah.
And I don't think crypto's going away, and I don't think blockchain is going away. But I think there's going to be a massive correction.
I bet non-fungible tokens are.
I don't think they will. I bet
the metaverse will be a bigger thing more quickly than NFTs.
I think NFTs and metaverse are kind of
the trough
interlinked.
Of shite or whatever it's called.
I think they're interlinked, because I think goods and services in the metaverse will probably be determined by NFT.
Speculate on what Apple is going to call theirs once they release the device.
Metaverse.
Yeah, they can't call it the metaverse. They'll call it
the
something
metaverse
else.
is the broader word for it.
Yeah, but they'll probably have their
Meta
own word.
itself has kind of grabbed it, hasn't it?
They'll have their own word for it.
Well, they changed their name to it because of the expression metaverse.
So they'll have to call it the Appleverse or whatever. The iVerse.
The Magverse? No. Yeah.
No,
the
I mean,
iVerse.
the metaverse was there before Facebook, a long time before Facebook. So
okay.
It's an expression that Neil Stephenson came up with in a book called Snow
70s
Crash.
or something.
But I still think that
it's the 1990s Snow Crash. It's not that old. It's not even as old as Neuromancer, which is the other big sort of sci-fi novel that people talk about that was sort of visionary.
That context.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my feeling. I share your scepticism, Ian, but I think what we're seeing is a sort of popping of a bubble. It will come back, but I think this is a necessary correction. It's obviously overhyped. I feel some Schadenfreude, but largely pity for people who've lost a lot of money on it. The only reason I've got any Schadenfreude is I've invested fuck all in any crypto.
Yeah.
If I'd invested loads, obviously I wouldn't be feeling like that.
And then you have all the people who are like, I'm sure there's tons of people in the world who are like, at some point were worth like 100 million and they cashed in on 10.
Yeah.
And now they lost 90. But you know what? Yeah, you still cash in on those 10.
I mean, that's the high stakes.
They're probably so depressed, but they still have
the high stakes game they're playing.
It depends what they came in with, doesn't it?
Yeah, if they came in nothing.
Okay, if they came in with nothing, then you're still going to be fairly okay, aren't you?
It all depends on how you look at it from an investment
You'd be like,
point of
oh
view.
shit, yeah.
Anyway, look, I'm going to wrap it up there. But that's interesting. And it's probably not going to go away. So we'll chat about it in future. And make sure you join us in case we do. See you later.